Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, as always, for joining. Our topic this evening is a continuation of the second in the four-part series of looking at the Siddur. I've done the normal structure of muting everyone, but please feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to make a comment or ask a question. And last week we looked at the structure of the Siddur. We discussed its origins and the editorship or authorship of the Siddur. The Siddur is a combination of a number of different mitzvahs merged together, whether Birchas HaShachar, which are Shevach and praise to Hashem, whether the brachas and Talmud Torah and learning in Birchas HaTorah, through to the mitzvah of Kriyas Shema, which ostensibly has nothing to do with Tefillah whatsoever, and the Amidah, which is the text created by the Anshe Knesset Gedolah at the start of the period of the second Beis Hamikdash, the second temple, the Amidah. We discussed the pyramid structure of Tefillah, in which the Siddur has been structured with the Amidah at the peak and a build up and build down from it. And we discussed how the shape of the Siddur as we have it is really from the time of the Geonim, even though component parts date back to the second Beis Hamikdash time and the Mishnah and the Gemara. Finally, we looked at the link that Chazal created in the Gemara and Brachos between these two separate mitzvahs, the mitzvah of Kriyas Shema and its surrounding brachos on the one hand, and the mitzvah of Amidah, davening on the other hand. And following the mitzvah of Kriyas Shema, we say bracha of Geula, in which we focus on the second mitzvah of Kriyas Shema. The first mitzvah of Kriyas Shema is Achtos Hashem, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, followed by the mitzvah of Ava. And then the final mitzvah of Kriyas Shema, Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, is remembering and recalling Egypt, after which we say a bracha of Geula. And Chazal in the Gemara and Brachos said that it was very important to link Geula and Tefillah. Even though these are two separate concepts, one needs to go straight from Go'al Yisrael into the Amidah, and this has significant halachic ramifications that we don't interrupt between Go'al Yisrael and the Amidah, according to some opinions, even with Amen on the very bracha itself, but certainly according to everyone, not with other interruptions. And Chazal said that this is something absolutely essential. This is through linking the two together, one is privileged to become a Ben Olam Haba, have a portion in the world to come. So somehow this is something magnificent and absolutely essential. And we looked at, use this as a little bit of a launch pad to understand a bit better what the Amidah is about. And Rabbi Yonah, we looked at in particular, who picked up two themes between the linkage of Geula and Tefillah, one of which was Liyosanu Lola Avodim, that we should be servants to Hashem, the recognition that through Yetzias Mitzrayim we became entered into servitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and this is the avodah of the Amidah, in which we recognize that we are avdoi, we are the servants of Hashem, and therefore he maintains us as in that position. And we discussed the paradox of this servitude as not being one which diminishes us, but on the contrary is one which builds us. The second explanation Rabbi Yonah gave, which we looked at the end, is that the concept is one of betochen. By recognizing and remind ourselves of the nisim that Hashem has done for us, we maintain our betochen, our trust in Hashem about the nisim that he will do in the future for us. And these are two key components of what the Amidah is about. It's about avdus, bowing and submitting to Hashem's authority, and betochen, trust in his care. There is a third explanation, which we're not going to look up inside, which is given by Rabbi Chiel Yaakov Weinberg. He's known as the Sridei Eish. He was a Gaon in Torah. He lived before the Second World War, survived the Second World War, ended up in Switzerland, and published a very important halachic work called the Sridei Eish. The literal meaning of the name of his sefer is Sridei Eish, the remnants of fire, indicating that he saw himself as a survivor, a refugee from the great and terrible fire of the Holocaust. He wrote an exceptionally important halachic work, and he discusses in one of his other works the link between Go'al Yisrael and the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah. And he says this is about linking the past redemption to our tefillah for future geula, for future redemption. And he stresses here that the belief in the future geula has to be founded on the belief in the past geula. In other words, our future can only be built by being rooted in the past. And this is the third idea, that Tefillah is about a reminder of our mission and sweep of history. Sort of seeing the history and the flow of history of Klal Yisrael from Yetzias Mitzrayim through to the ultimate Geula. So this is the third explanation of the link. I want to share, though, inside a fourth explanation of the link, and we'll see hopefully at the end why all these four explanations are important. And this explanation is found by Rashi on the page of the Gemara, in which the Gemara speaks about the importance of linking Geula and Tefillah. And I'll just read, I'll put up on the screen the quote from Rashi, and we'll learn together for a few minutes, a few pages of Rashi, a few lines of Rashi. And this is highlighting the Rashi here. It's in source 1. Rashi over here, Rashi on the sugya over there. Zer hasomech, Rashi says that the importance is to link Geula to Tefillah. V'kol shekain deshachris, the ikar Geulas Mitzrayim shachris. Let's not go into the technicalities of that. This applies to all the Tefillahs. But let's now go down to the third line of Rashi, in which he quotes a Gemara Yerushalmi. And this is where we're starting from, where I've highlighted it. Misha eino somech Geula Tefillah, lemahu doma. Someone who doesn't join Geula Tefillah, what are they comparable to? Le'oihavoy shel melech, sheba v'dofek al pischoi shel melech. To the lover, the friend of the king, who comes knocking at the door of the king. Yot ha-melech v'nimtzu shiflik, if the king comes out and sees that his friend has left, afiru iflich, so the king also gives up and leaves. Elo yeh odom mekariv lakadosh baruch hu elov, a person should draw Hashem near, umratzeu b'tishbachus for close in Yetzias Mitzrayim, to recognizing and acknowledging the exodus from Egypt. V'hu miskariv elov, and in return, Hashem draws near to that person. And once they are near, they need to ask Hashem their requests. So in this fourth explanation of the significance of linking Geula to Tefillah, it's about a relationship. So Tefillah might be about avdus, servitude. Tefillah might be about betochen, trust. It might be about the sweeping sense of mission and history, and linking our past Geula to the future and recognizing there's a purpose and a direction that we are going. But the fourth explanation, that's of Rashi, is it's about relationship. Tefillah is when we knock on the door in the Birchas Kriya Shema, we recognize Hashem, Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad, we give praise for Yetzias Mitzrayim. Now that we have knocked on the door, we need to wait for our Ohavoi. We are the friends of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the friendship to be connected by having the engagement of Tefillah. If we say the praise of Hashem and we recognize Him in Shema, and then we don't immediately daven, we are not somech Geula Tefillah. We're simply not engaging in the relationship. So this is a fourth exercise in Tefillah. It's a relationship. It's our chance to converse with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because this is what one does when one has a friendship and connection. We're knocking on the door and we are speaking at the doorway, at the front door, speaking to Hashem. So we have four very different models of Tefillah, each of which is very important. We have a model in which Tefillah is submission and avdus. We have a model in which Tefillah is betochen and belief. We have a model in which Tefillah is about mission and history, but finally, we have a model in which Tefillah is about relationship. It's a siach, a conversation, a interaction with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is the introduction to the Amidah, using this important Gemara, which speaks about needing to link Geula to Tefillah. It sounds like a very technical Gemara, and as we've seen, it brings out a number of important themes in the topic. Hopefully, by the end of today's share, we'll have time to revisit these themes of Tefillah and see how they all find expression in the first bracha of the Amidah, which we will look at in the second part of the share. For now, though, I want to move on to the opening words of Tefillah, which is the request of Hashem, Safosai Tiftach, Ufi Yagid Tilosecha. Hashem, open my lips so that my mouth can say your praise. Now, again, the Gemara that talks about the importance of linking Geula and Tefillah tells us something very significant about Hashem's Safosai Tiftach, because the Gemara asks, how can we intrude and interrupt with Hashem Sefosai Tiftach between the bracha of Gal Yisrael and the beginning of the Amidah. Surely, if the halacha is that it's so important to begin the Amidah immediately upon saying Gal Yisrael, how can we say Hashem Sefosai Tiftach at all? How can we interrupt with this pasuk? And the Gemara answers with essential and crucial words. This is again the same Gemara that says about how important it is to have Tefillah and Geula joined, as we've discussed. And the Gemara answers, no. Hashem Sefosai Tiftach is Tefillah Arichta Dami. It's part of an extended Tefillah. That means to say that Hashem Sefosai Tiftach isn't just a nice addition to the Amidah, but it is a crucial and fundamental part of the Tefillah. It's a part of the Amidah itself. So if we ask, when do we start the Amidah? The answer is not with Baruch Atah Hashem at the beginning of the Amidah, the formal text of Amidah as created by the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, but with this pasuk of Hashem Sefosai Tiftach. More than that, we understand that this is essential to Tefillah because this is the start of Amidah. Now, why is it essential? Why do we need to open with Hashem Sefosai Tiftach? If we are asking for the ability to move our lips and let our body function so that we can talk to Hashem, well, it's certainly appropriate to do so, but surely this is just a part of what the Amidah itself is about. In the Amidah, we ask for the functioning of our body. Rafeinu Hashem, we ask for help. This is just simply part of the general process of asking and recognizing that we need Hashem even for our most basic bodily functions. So what is this request of Hashem Sefosai Tiftach, such that it is so essential that it can, in a sense, interrupt between Gal Yisrael and the Amidah because it becomes part of the Amidah itself? What's so essential about it? And the answer to this question is something we touched upon last week also. I mentioned there a argument between the Rishonim about whether the obligation to daven is a deraisa, is min haTorah or not. The chiyuv to daven, is it min haTorah or not? However, I reference there the comment of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who said that even those who are of the opinion that the obligation to daven is not min haTorah, nonetheless the concept of tefillah, in the language of the Briskers, the cheft of tefillah, the abstract entity of tefillah, the concept of tefillah, that is min haTorah, that is a Torah concept. In other words, the idea that we can stand in front of God and speak to him, that is something that we have a source for from the Torah. And the source of this is the many examples in the Torah where we find people davening from, let's say, in a couple of weeks' time, Yitzchak and Rivka davening in front of Hashem for children, or Moshe davening for Kriyas Yamsuf, or davening for the refuah, the healing of his sister Miriam when she got tzaras, or davening for the Jews to be forgiven for the Egel. The concept of tefillah is one we find from the Torah. Now, the point behind this, the idea behind this, is that it is not obvious that we can daven at all. Were it not for the fact that we found the concept of tefillah in the Torah, we wouldn't think that we were able to daven. Who says we can stand in front of Hashem and engage in this type of conversation? Who says we can speak to him? We're not Nevi'im, we're not prophets, we're simple people. Who says this is a function of human behavior whatsoever? We humans can walk, we can talk, we can do all sorts of things, but who says we can pray? Who says we can daven to Hashem? What tells us that this is something that we have the power and ability to do? What tells us that this is something of effect that is effective in any way whatsoever? And the answer is, this is what the Torah has taught us by telling us that the chefta, the concept, the entity called tefillah is min haTorah, that it exists, the possibility of davening. However, we need to recognize that this is a privilege. We need to recognize that this is not something to be taken for granted. And therefore, when we say Hashem Sefosai Tiftach or Fi Yagid Tehillah, we're not so much asking for Hashem's assistance to physically move my lips and my mouth to declare his praise, but we're asking for his permission to so do. We're asking for his authorization to do this. The idea that I can stand in front of Hashem with my flaws and my failures and my lack of spirituality and my material existence, and I can turn to Hashem and ask him and speak to him, that is not something to take for granted. And therefore Hashem Sefosai Tiftach is a a start of tefillah, a necessary prerequisite, an introduction to tefillah, tefillah arichta. It's a continuation of tefillah. It is enough to justify saying even between Gad Yisrael and the core part of the Amidah, because it's a necessary preliminary introduction. Therefore, when we say it, this should be our reflection. That's the point of time in tefillah in which we recognize, in a sense, I haven't yet started davening, but paradoxically, I need to be able to daven to be able to daven. Even the very utensil, the keli, the receptacle that can receive the bracha, that itself needs to be given to us by Hashem. It's not that I am a fit receptacle and into that Hashem will shower his blessing, but the receptacle itself needs the gift of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore Hashem's Fasai Tiftach or Fiyah Gitzurasecha. So before we are Omid Lifnei HaMokim, before we recognize that we are standing in front of Hashem, which is the most basic meditation of tefillah, the most basic reflection of tefillah. The kavanah of tefillah is that of Omeid Lifnei HaMokim, I'm standing in front of Hashem. The prerequisite to that, the thing that comes first, is Hashem's Fasai Tiftach, requesting permission to be an Oved Hashem at all, requesting permission to engage in this relationship in the language of Rashi, to engage in this conversation. So this is Hashem Fasai Tiftach. The next thing we need to talk about is the concept of kavanah, and this is something I hope to visit again, perhaps on another occasion. But for now, I just want to make a couple of comments about it. We use the words kavanah a lot. Kavanah is something spoken about in all sorts of contexts, and it's important to understand that it doesn't always mean one thing. It can mean lots of different concepts. Now, in the context of tefillah, how are we meant to understand what kavanah means? What is kavanah? Intentionality that we were meant to have when we daven. And as I said, I don't want to go into this in too much length in this particular setting, but I'll simply point out that when we use the word kavanah, there's three ways it's used in the context of tefillah. The first sense in which we use it is, as with many mitzvahs, a discussion where the mitzvahs tzrichos kavanah. Do mitzvahs need intentionality? When I do a mitzvah, do I need to have kavanah? Now, kavanah here doesn't mean something abstract or something very complicated. We're not talking about a depth of insight into the purpose of the mitzvah. We simply mean an awareness that as I am doing the mitzvah, I'm fulfilling the mitzvah. I'm fulfilling a command of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, do mitzvahs need kavanah or not? Meaning to say, when I do a mitzvah, do I need to be aware that I'm doing a mitzvah or not? So, for example, if someone is reading through the Torah and happens to learn or read the verses of Shema, but when they are doing so are not consciously thinking, I'm doing this as a fulfillment of my obligation to say Shema, have they fulfilled the mitzvah? Do they need to repeat Shema or no? They've already done the mitzvah because the fact is they said Shema. Or perhaps a Baal Tekeh who is practicing blowing the shofar and it doesn't occur to them at this particular point to fulfill the mitzvah, and later they don't get a chance to blow. Can they say, well, I blew the shofar as I was practicing, therefore I've already fulfilled the mitzvah or not? So this is one concept. When I'm doing a mitzvah, I should be conscious that I'm doing the mitzvah in order to fulfill my obligation in mitzvahs. Now, how do we paskin? How do we rule? Do you need to do a mitzvah with kavanah or not? And the consensus is that for a mitzvah d'oraisa, a Torah obligation, one should have in mind that one is doing a mitzvah. However, for a mitzvah d'rabbanan, even if one doesn't have in mind that one's doing a mitzvah, one has fulfilled one's obligation. Now, we've seen that even though the 3 times a day tefillah is not a Torah obligation, even though the words of tefillah are not a Torah obligation, however, we saw last week, the Rambam is of the opinion that the obligation to daven at least once a day is a Torah obligation. And as I mentioned earlier, there's discussion about whether this is the case or not, but certainly this is the view of a very prominent Rishon, very prominent halachic authority, the Rambam, that davening once a day is a mitzvah, an obligation, a chiyuv min haTorah. And therefore one should certainly have kavanah type number 1, which is I'm fulfilling the mitzvah of davening, of prayer as I engage in tefillah. So this is the next thing one should think about. After one says Hashem's Fasai Tiftach, I have in mind that I'm fulfilling the mitzvah, the obligation to pray. Kavanah number 2, the second nature of kavanah, is that I am oimeid lifnei hamokim. I'm standing in front of Hashem and addressing Him. Now, the reason this kavanah is essential is because many other mitzvahs are mechanical. What defines the action is the physical action I've done. I've blown the shofar. I've shaken the lulav and esrog. And maybe I need to have intention that I'm doing the mitzvah as an obligation, as a fulfillment of my obligation. But what makes it a blowing of a shofar is because physically it is a blowing of the shofar. What makes it a taking of a lulav and esrog is because physically I've taken the lulav and esrog. However, tefillah is more abstract than that. Tefillah isn't physical motion. It's not just the movement of my lips and the saying of certain words. Tefillah is a direct communication and address to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, it's only the action of tefillah, if I am aware as I'm engaged in tefillah, that I am oimed lifnei hamakom, that I'm standing in front of Hashem. Every other mitzvah, as long as I know I'm doing a mitzvah, it is that action. It is a blowing of the shofar. It is a shaking of a lulav and esrog. It is saying a kriya shema. But with tefillah, it only becomes a tefillah if I'm conscious that I am addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu in so doing. Now, omed lifnei hamakom, standing in front of Hashem, is a complicated and profound, almost meditative experience. How so? Because to really be conscious of standing in front of Hashem takes quite a lot of reflection and intentionality. One has to be aware of oneself as a humble human being, standing in the presence of Hashem. So this is the depth of kavanah when one is engaged in tefillah, omed lifnei hamakom. However, as a minimum, one should at least be aware that one is addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is the second sort of kavanah that we're dealing with over here. As a minimum, an awareness that one is addressing Hashem, ideally a more profound state in which one is conscious of standing in front of Hashem and in His presence. This is the second kavanah of tefillah. The third kavanah of tefillah is Peirush HaMilos, translation of the words that one is saying. And ideally speaking, one should understand everything one is saying in the Amidah, or at least as a minimum understand the first bracha, or perhaps even the first three brachas of the Amidah. And this is the third kavanah, because if indeed I am addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I should understand the words I'm saying, so that I'm conscious of what I'm saying to Hashem. Nonetheless, certainly with the later brachas, even if I don't understand them, it is still a tefillah, because the words carry a meaning in themselves. These are the words of Lashon HaKodesh, which carry in them the content of what I'm saying. The fact is, I am saying these words in front of Hashem. And therefore, even if I'm only aware that I'm only lifnei hamakom, I'm standing in front of Hashem, and I know that I'm asking for things for myself, or praising Hashem by thanking Him, even if I don't understand every word, at least I know what I'm doing. I know I'm speaking to Hashem, and I'm saying words which are important. Is this an ideal tefillah? Certainly not. Ideally, I should understand what I'm saying. Nonetheless, if I don't, at least for the later brachas, at least I am still addressing Hashem and speaking to Him, and therefore there is a fulfillment of the mitzvah. So these are the three kavanahs that apply to tefillah, and one should reflect on the first two as one is about to start davening, and the third as one davens itself. The first two are intention to fulfill the mitzvah, and that I'm omed lifnei hamakom, I'm standing in front of Hashem, I am addressing Him, and finally, that as one says the words, one should try and understand them. Now, the language used to determine that we are standing in front of Hashem in this context is omed lifnei hamakom. Makom is an unusual term to use for Hashem. Makom means place, and it refers to the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the place of the world. He is the foundation of our existence. He is Makomo Shel Olam. He has shared of His existence with us, but He is the basis. He is the foundation that creates space, if you like, for us to exist. Makom is used in various contexts. Each time we use this unusual title for Hashem, in a few moments we'll see Hashem has many names, Yud Kei Vav Kei Elokim, etc. famously. Makom is one of the less used names of Hashem. Nonetheless, it is used in this context over here. And each time it's used, we need to ask ourselves, why is that the phrase that's used? And the answer over here is very simple, because we are conscious as we are davening that Hashem is Makomo Shel Olam. He is the foundation of our existence, that He has shared of His existence with us, and therefore we are standing in front of Hashem, recognizing Him as Makom, as the one that provides the source of our existence. So this is Hashem Sefasai Tiftach, followed by the preliminary kavanos and intentions that one needs as one davens. I'll pause there just in case there are any questions, and otherwise we will move into the bracha of others. I've just had a question by text over here. Does this mean that one can only daven the Amidah in Hebrew? Or if one doesn't understand the Hebrew, can you daven in English? So this is an excellent question. Tefillah can be said in any language. Nonetheless, it is better if it is said in Hebrew. Why can Tefillah be said in any language? Because we are addressing HaKadosh Baruch Hu and we can speak to him in any language. Nonetheless, it's better if it's said in Lashon HaKodesh, because Lashon HaKodesh conveys the meaning in the best possible manner. Translation always loses a nuance and a depth and a precision of expression, and therefore Lashon HaKodesh is the better way of davening. Now, what should one do if one doesn't understand Tefillah, and what's the correct balance to be found between davening in English and davening in Lashon HaKodesh, davening in English or davening in Hebrew? Well, certainly one can and should say some tefillahs in English, meaning to say that even though we now have a fixed text for tefillah, as we discussed last week, coined by the men of the Great Assembly, we should still also put in our own personal tefillahs. And given that we would struggle to express ourselves in Hebrew, we should do so in English. So certainly it is appropriate and right that all of us should speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in English. And very often this can be a very important part of our tefillah, in which we are most conscious of standing and speaking to Hashem, given that it is not easy for us to speak in Hebrew to him. So certainly that part of tefillah should be said in English. What about the rest of the tefillah? Well, I would encourage one to say that in Hebrew, even though one loses an aspect of tefillah through so doing, because of the content that the Hebrew carries. If we would start switching the regular tefillah to English, which one can do halachically, as I've just said, we would give up the fixed text of tefillah as created by Chazal, and perhaps never achieve the outcome we desire, which is to be able to daven in Hebrew. What should one do then with the sense of frustration that one feels as one's davening in Hebrew and doesn't understand it? And the answer is invest the time to learn how to understand it. So rather than us switching out of Lashon HaKodesh, we should invest the time in understanding the meaning of the word. Amidah is not a very long tefillah, and it doesn't need to involve a huge amount of time to understand basically the meaning of every word, even though one won't have a depth of understanding, which is something one can build up over the years. I'm talking about someone who is a regular davener and is matured in their journey in Yiddishkeit. Obviously, there can be people who are nearer the beginning of a journey and perhaps struggle with reading and struggle with the Hebrew, and Amidah would become torturous. In that case, probably on a case-by-case basis, they should consult with a Rav and work out what the correct balance is. Someone who has a length of experience should daven in Lashon HaKodesh, and if they don't understand it, should invest time in so doing. Obviously, you don't need me to tell you there are many excellent Siddurim in English, which one can use as one davens, but it becomes a bit clunky if each time one needs to look across at the meaning. But if one starts doing that, then over time one will learn the meaning itself. So this is the concept of kavanah, understanding Perush Hamilas, the meaning of the word. And the person who posted the question on the chat group is absolutely correct that it can be done in English. Also in strict halacha, though ideally one should elevate one's ability such that one is able to daven in Hebrew. Yeah, someone posted, can I just explain again about hamakom with regard to kavanah? Yes, the reason why the language is used of Omeid Lifnei Hamakom is because as I'm standing in front of Hashem, I'm conscious of him being Makomo Shel Olam, of him being the root of my existence. This is the basic meditation of standing in prayer in front of Hashem has two possibilities. Either I reflect upon the Beis HaMikdash and I see myself as standing in Yerushalayim, in the Beis HaMikdash, standing in front of the Kodesh HaKadoshim and facing towards it. We know that we daven in the direction of the Beis HaMikdash. And some people find this as a form of kavanah that works for them and enhances their tefillah. And hopefully in next week or 2 weeks' time, I'll address one of the ways of approaching that perspective. But in the context of what I'm talking about now, I'm focusing on the second type of kavanah, which is I'm conscious I'm standing in front of Hashem in a more internal process. In other words, I'm recognizing that the root of my existence, the wonder of my existence, it's not obvious that I should exist. Why do I exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And what is that based? It's because HaKadosh Baruch Hashem has shared of his existence with us. There's something godly within us that our existence itself is founded and shared with founded upon and shared with the existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore we talk about Omed Lifnei HaMokum, I'm standing in front of Hashem with an awareness that he is my Mokum, he is the provider of my space, the space for me to exist. So this is a second explanation of this is the Omed Lifnei HaMokum, and an explanation of why that language of Mokum is used as the particular name for Hashem. Okay, let's move on now to the first bracha
Rabbi
of
Zobin,
the... Yes.
Could I just ask one more question, if you don't mind?
Please do, yes.
Bearing in mind what you've said about the kavanas, if one gets to the end of davening and taking 3 steps forwards and back and suddenly realise that actually you've just compiled your whole shopping list but haven't actually had any kavana for the tefillah, should one therefore be repeating the tefillah again, or does that then turn it into a bracha levatala, or what happens at that stage?
Okay, excellent question. So firstly, I have davened. In other words, there's 2 aspects to what I'm doing when I'm saying the Amidah. The first thing is I'm fulfilling an obligation, according to the Rambam, who says this is a deraisa Torah obligation. But the second thing is I am davening. Now, someone who doesn't think about the fulfillment of the obligation, but only thinks about the fact that they are davening, is davening still. They are davening. They are requesting of Hashem what they want. However, they didn't bear in mind that they are also fulfilling an obligation to so do. Now, let's think what has happened in this situation. Well, the obligation to daven once a day is a Torah obligation. The obligation to daven 3 times a day, and in the form and the text that we do, only Drabanon. Drabanon, it's a chiyuv, it's an obligation, but not a Torah obligation. Torah obligations, if one hasn't had the intention to fulfill the obligation, one needs to repeat. Rabbinic obligations, one doesn't need to repeat. Therefore, one has said one's Amidah. The Amidah, one said, has been a good tefillah. It's a very excellent tefillah. Unfortunately, one hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah of tefillah. Perhaps one hasn't fulfilled the obligation to daven. Therefore, one should still say a short tefillah to Hashem. Nonetheless, one doesn't need to repeat the Amidah in so doing, because that's the Rabbanon extension of the mitzvah, and that one doesn't need to repeat, even though one didn't have kavanah, one didn't have intention. So one should try and say at least one tefillah a day, just very briefly, Hashem, help me, please look after me, and have intention that one is fulfilling one's mitzvah, and through so doing, mitzvahs tzrichas kavanah, one has fulfilled the obligation. That's the simplest understanding. The topic of mitzvah tzrichas kavanah is a complicated one, and which mitzvahs it doesn't apply to. So I've slightly simplified the issue, but in terms of practice, if one hasn't had intention to fulfill the mitzvah of davening, one should just say a short tefillah, and that way one has fulfilled one's deraisa, one's Torah obligation to daven. I was asked last week, and hopefully we'll find an opportunity to do so. I don't think it will be part of this mini-series, but maybe another one, to speak about the chiyuv of women in davening. But you are aware that if one is at a stage in life in which one isn't able to daven, then at least due to obligations, family commitments, and other home obligations and other such things, at least say 1 tefillah a day means one's fulfilled one's Torah obligation. And as I said, that 1 tefillah can take a second or 2 to daven. But we'll discuss that in more detail when we get to the halachas. But that's a fulfillment of the Torah obligation, and it's that one about which mitzvah tzrichas kavanah applies. So this is the kavanah aspect. Now we move on to the first bracha of the Amidah, and this bracha is known as avos, avot, fathers. Why is it known as avos? Well, because the structure of the bracha takes as its theme Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. In other words, it takes as its theme the relationship of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov to Hashem, and this is why the bracha is called avos. And I just want to spend a little bit of time exploring what the nature of this bracha is, and in the context of our subject, which isn't just trying to understand tefillah, but is trying specifically to understand the structure of the Siddur, I want to understand why we open tefillah, why the first bracha is about avos. And this is a question that deserves to be answered on many levels, and we're going to try and use the time available to answer it on several of these levels. And the first explanation is because Tefillah, as we know, was established as a recognition of the prayer of the Ovos. We'll look very briefly at the Gemara that teaches us this, and therefore I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to have a look at the top of the screen, the number 3 on the screen. If I can just put this up. This is the Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara Brachos says, Itmav highlighted the source 3, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina Omer, Tfilos Ovos Tiknum. The Ovos established the Tfilos, Rabbi Shua ben Levi Omer Tfilos Keneged Tamidim Tiknum. The Tfilos were established paralleling the Korbanos. The Gemara then goes on and discusses both of these opinions. Last week we looked at the idea that it parallels the Korbanos a little bit. We touched upon it, and I mentioned that even in the time in the second Beis HaMikdash, when Korbanos were being brought, nonetheless, they still were davening. Tefillah was already established then. Chazal say Tefillah was created by the Anshe Knesset of Gedolah at the beginning of the Second Temple era, even though they had Korbanos. We have archaeological records of shuls that existed in this period of the second Beis HaMikdash. Nonetheless, they were established connected the Korbanos. But the second explanation, the first explanation of the Gemara is Tfilos Ovos Tiknum. They were established by the Ovos. And then the pasuk, the Gemara goes on to tell us the story of each of the Ovos when they davened. Avram davened Shachris, Yitzchak davened Mincha, and Yaakov davened Mariv. Now we will revisit why each of them davened that particular tefillah. But this is the first reason why we start off with Ovos, because the tefillahs themselves were created as part of the as linking to the Ovos who each of them davened these 3 tefillahs. But let's try and go a little bit deeper into this, and I'm going to try and understand a bit better what's really going on over here. Now, I have a lot that I want to say about this, and I see we're running a little bit short of time. So given that this week is Lech Lecha, maybe I'll just focus on a couple of sources which tie in this topic to Lech Lecha, even though we'll really only have a chance to explore this properly next week. And therefore, I'm just going to introduce a couple of the Pesukim, and the next week we will look at this in greater depth. And the first source I want to look at is a Pasuk at the beginning of this week's Sedra. I'm going to share the screen again just for us to look at this Pasuk together. This is at the bottom of the page, source 5. Vayomer Shaman Avram, familiar pasuk this week's Sedra. Lech lecha mihatzecha mimeladzecha mibeis bicha la'aretz asher arecha. Leave your homelands and go to the land that I will show you. Ve'eschel l'goy gadol, I will make you into a great nation. Va'varcha, and I will bless you. Va'gadol shemecha, and I will make your name great. Ve'heyei baracha, and you will be a blessing. What is this promise of Hashem? Ve'eschel l'goy gadol, va'varcha, va'gadol shemecha, ve'heyei baracha. So Rashi comments on this, and Rashi gives several explanations. But in the second explanation of Rashi, Dova Acher, the alternative opinion, says Rashi, the reason we say Lekei Avram is because Hashem promised, I will make you a great nation. Vavarcha, I will bless you. I will make you. We say that Lekei Yitzchak. V'gadol shemecha, Yaakov. This is why we say Lekei Yaakov. Now at the end of the bracha, we conclude Baruch Atah Hashem, Mogein Avram, the shield of Avram. Why do we only conclude the bracha with Avram? Says Rashi, Yochel, number 4, Yochel Yechos Min B'Kolom. One might have thought that one concludes the bracha with all 4 expressions. Tamid Loma V'Yei Bracha, you Avram will be a bracha. B'Chachos Min V'Lo Bahem. The conclusion of the bracha of the Amidah is with you and not with the rest of them. So just to summarize what we've read, the reason why we mention Lekei Avram and Lekei Yitzchak and Lekei Yaakov is because right at the beginning of the mission of Avram, Lech Lecha Mi'atzcha, we read about in this Sedra, he was promised, according to this insight of Rashi, based on the Medrash, that you and your son and your grandson, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, we will use your names as a way of praising Hashem. But the conclusion of the bracha will be with you, Avram. So this is the first link to Lech Lecha and to Avram. There's a second link in the bracha to Lech Lecha and Avram, which is a continuation of the story in the Sedra. Now, if you remember the continuation of the Sedra, Avram goes to Eretz Yisrael, And at one stage, he has an encounter with a battle in which his nephew Lot is captured, and he sets out to redeem Lot and save him. And he is privileged to so do. However, he is worried about the success of his mission and worried that he has damaged himself in so doing. And therefore, Hashem appears to Avram and reassures him, don't worry, I am there for you. And this is the second link between Avram and the brachas, a link which we will discuss next week, linked to next week, etc. Achad dvarim ha'eleh. So I've highlighted this is source 7. Hoya devar Shem al Avram b'machzeh leimo. Al tira Avram anochi mogen lecha tzchocha b'me'od. I will protect you, I will be a shield. So this is the next link to Avram, that Avram, as yet still called Avram in this week's Sedra, Hashem promises he will be a mogen Avram. Anochi mogen lecha, I will be your shield. And this is the source of the conclusion of the bracha of mogen Avram. Finally, there is a third link between this week's Sedra and the first bracha, which is the use of the term Kel Elyon, which finds its appearance in this week's in the bracha. We refer to Hashem as Kel Elyon, the God upon high, the high God, the supreme God, the elevated God. And this is a phrase associated with a non-Jew who appears in this week's Sedra, Malki Tzedek. After Avram defeats the kingdoms of the 4 kings and rescues his nephew Lot, etc., Malki Tzedek comes out to greet them, and this is source 6 over here. Or Malki Tzedek Melech Sholem. I'm just trying to highlight this. Malki Tzedek, this is source 6. Malki Tzedek, the king of Sholem, Hotzi Lechem V'Yayin. What is Malki Tzedek? V'hu Kohen Lekel Elyon. He is a Kohen to Kel Elyon, to the elevated God. So Malki Tzedek has a unique way of serving Hashem and calls himself the Kel Elyon. Vayovalchei vayomer baruch Avram. He gives Avram a bracha. The Kel Elyon. Second time he uses the phrase Kel Elyon because this is how he relates to Hashem. Or Baruch Kel Elyon Hashem mogein sorecha etc. B'yodecha. Blessed are you, Avram, that the Kel Elyon protected you and acted as your shield. So we're running out of time, but just to conclude the link that we're making over here in these last few minutes of the shir, Avram has the others appear in the first bracha of the Amidah because of something to do with the very dawn of history. It's promised to Avram in the pasuk of Lech Lecha. Why are all 3 mentioned? Evidently because the way they relate to Hashem, each and one of them in their own way, are important for us to relate to Hashem and how we connect to the Amidah. We give Hashem many names, as we mentioned. We mentioned the name Mokom. We mentioned the name Kel Elyon, which is the way that Malki Tzedek relates to Hashem in his service. So Hashem sometimes is Avinu, he's sometimes our father, sometimes he's Malkeinu, our king. He also has 3 more names. It's a remarkable thing. Elokei Avram becomes a name of Hashem. The God has taught to us and revealed to us and shown to us by Avram. That method of describing Hashem, Elokei Avram, becomes a name of Hashem. But Elokei Yitzchak and Elokei Yaakov also become a name of Hashem. So what the Amidah is telling us is that we need to connect to Hashem using different names, different modes of connection. And this, therefore, is going to be an absolutely essential exploration that we need to do next week, which as we start the Amidah, we need to open by saying, but who are we to stand in front of Hashem? How do we link to him? And the answer is, we are B'nai, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We are the descendants of these 3 others, and therefore we can give and describe a name to Hashem built upon what they taught us about him and how we are meant to relate. And therefore, others is an essential and fitting introduction to the Amidah. But what this element of all these 3 names, plus the name of Kel Elyon, plus Mogen Avram means, is what we will look at next week. But I want to finish just with one practical thought. It is true that we name Hashem Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. And we'll speak about that next week. We haven't got there this week. But we also call him Elokei Nu, our God. That means to say that Hashem's name isn't just Elokei Avram, it's not just Melech, it's not just Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, it's not just Elokim, it's not just Kel Elyon. He also has a name called Elokeinu, our God. And we don't reflect and stop when we say so many times a day, Baruch Atah Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, fantastic elevated name of Hashem, Elokeinu, Melech Olam. He's not just the Melech, but he's Elokeinu. Now the halacha is that one cannot be moichek the Shem Hashem. One cannot erase the name of Hashem. If one erases the nun vav, the nu of Elokeinu, one is erasing part of the name of Hashem, because this becomes part of the name of Hashem. He is Elokeinu. This is a way of connecting. This is a label that we humans give to him. We humans struggle to relate to the all-powerful infinite God. We give names to capture the best we can of our relationship to him. A name is a relationship. A human can have many names. To an outsider, they can be called Mr. X or Mrs. Y. To a child, they can be called Mommy or Daddy. Humans have many names. Hashem has many names which reflect our ability to relate to him. We use these names, but one of the names we are entitled to give him is Elokeinu. And that becomes therefore a name of Hashem, because this is how we connect him. So this is a parting thought when we daven the Amidah next time, and we think about these introductions that we spoke about. As we say the first word, Elokeinu, to recognize that he is our God, that means there's a unique awareness of Hashem that only we can bring into the world. There's a name of Hashem that will be missing if we don't label him Elokeinu, if we don't recognize Hashem. So with that, I will conclude for today. We've used and more than used our allocated 45 minutes. I'll just stay online in case there's any questions that anyone wants to ask. But I'll stop now, and next week we'll revisit the bracha of others as our introduction to the structure of Tefillah, the Siddur.
I want to thank you so much. It's beautiful. Thank you very, very much. It's so clear.